Picture this: a bustling village square, alive with the roar of the crowd, the thud of bodies hitting the dirt, and the unmistakable sound of laughter mixed with gasps of disbelief. This wasn't just any ordinary day in medieval Europe. It was a day for games. But forget everything you think you know about sports and entertainment today. Back then, fun was a wild, unpredictable spectacle where the rules were loose, the stakes were high, and the games were, well, downright bizarre. From jousting atop rolling barrels to wrestling matches where the competitors were blindfolded and armed with sacks of flour, medieval folks didn't just play to pass the time. They invented ways to thrill, shock, and delight each other in ways that would leave us scratching our heads today. What drove people to invent such outrageous pastimes? Imagine living in a world without smartphones, television, or even books. For most people, entertainment wasn't something you consumed, it was something you created, often with whatever you had on hand. A pig could become the star of a jousting tournament. A simple ball game could turn into a chaotic, village-wide brawl. These games weren't just about fun, they were a release, a way to bond, and sometimes a test of sheer bravery. And the strangest part, many of these games were more than just idle distractions. They were woven into the fabric of medieval life, tied to festivals, holidays, and even religious traditions. So why should we care about these long-forgotten amusements? Because they reveal something extraordinary about human creativity and the universal need for joy. Whether it was the thrill of competition, the laughter of the crowd, or the sheer absurdity of the challenges, medieval games remind us that fun doesn't need to be polished or predictable to be unforgettable. In this video, we're diving headfirst into 25 of the most bizarre, hilarious, and sometimes shocking games that once entertained the masses. You'll discover how a simple idea like tying two people together and letting them swing clubs at each other could become the highlight of the year. Get ready to step into a world where the line between sport and spectacle blurred, and where the only rule was that there were no rules. The Middle Ages were anything but boring, and by the end of this journey, you'll see why. If you think jousting was all about noble knights and shining armor, think again. One of the most riotous spectacles in medieval Europe was pig jousting, a game where dignity went out the window and chaos took center stage. Imagine two riders perched on wobbly platforms, armed not with lances but with simple wooden sticks, their real target. A very confused, very squealing pig placed precariously between them. The goal: knock the poor animal off its perch without losing your own balance. Easier said than done when the crowd is howling with laughter and the pig is doing everything in its power to escape. This wasn't just mindless fun, though. Pig jousting was a test of skill wrapped in absurdity. The riders had to stay upright while swinging at the pig, often ending up in the mud themselves, much to the delight of onlookers. And the pig, well, it usually won in the end, dodging and scrambling away while knights turned, clowns flailed in the dirt. Festivals and fairs loved this game because it turned the seriousness of traditional jousting on its head. Instead of honor and glory, the prize was pure, unfiltered amusement. But why a pig? In medieval Europe, pigs were everywhere, hardy, loud, and stubborn, the perfect unwilling participant in a game designed to entertain. Their unpredictable movements made the contest even more hilarious, ensuring no two rounds were ever the same. And let's be honest, watching someone try to knock a squealing pig off a platform while struggling not to fall themselves is comedy gold, whether you're a peasant or a king. This bizarre pastime reveals something deeper about medieval life. Entertainment didn't have to be refined to be unforgettable. It was raw, messy, and full of surprises, a reminder that laughter hasn't changed much over the centuries. Whether it was the thrill of the chase or the sheer ridiculousness of the spectacle, pig jousting proved one thing. When it came to fun, the Middle Ages knew how to deliver. If pig jousting was absurd, blind man's bluff wrestling took medieval entertainment to a whole new level of chaos. Picture this: two burly competitors, blindfolded and disoriented, stumbling around a muddy pit while a rowdy crowd cheered and placed bets on who would faceplant first. This wasn't just wrestling, it was a hilarious, unpredictable free-for-all where brute strength meant nothing if you couldn't even find your opponent. The rules were simple but brutal. Wrestlers had to rely entirely on touch and sound, lunging at every grunt or shuffling footstep in the dirt. More often than not, they'd end up grappling thin air, accidentally shoving the referee, or even locking arms with a spectator who got too close. The crowd loved every minute of it. The clumsier the match, the louder the laughter, and the bets. They weren't just about who'd win, but how spectacularly someone would fail. Why did this game captivate medieval audiences? Because it stripped away the usual advantages. A seasoned wrestler could be humbled by a lucky shove from a first-timer. It wasn't just about skill, it was about adaptability, sheer luck, and the sheer spectacle of watching grown men flail like drunkards. Festivals often featured this game as a highlight, drawing huge crowds eager for a dose of unscripted comedy. But there was a deeper layer to the madness. Blind man's bluff wrestling mirrored life in the Middle Ages, unpredictable, messy, and full of surprises. One moment you're confident, the next you're flat on your back, wondering what hit you. It was a reminder that even the strongest could be undone by uncertainty, and that sometimes the best entertainment came from embracing the chaos. This game also had a sneaky way of leveling the playing field. Nobles and commoners alike could compete, and victory often went to the underdog, the person who kept their cool amid the confusion. In a society rigid with hierarchy, blind man's bluff wrestling was a rare moment where everyone was equally vulnerable, and that was part of its magic. So the next time you think of medieval sports, don't just imagine polished tournaments and chivalry. Remember the raw, unfiltered hilarity of blindfolded wrestlers tripping over their own feet, proving that sometimes the best games are the ones where no one has control. Fox tossing might just be one of the most jaw-dropping and controversial spectacles to emerge from medieval Europe. Picture this: noblemen and women gathered in grand courtyards, gripping the corners of sturdy blankets while live foxes were placed in the center. With a coordinated heave, they'd launch the terrified animals skyward, competing to see whose toss sent the fox flying highest. It was equal parts sport, status symbol, and sheer absurdity, a bizarre pastime that blurred the line between entertainment and outright cruelty. Why would anyone think this was a good idea? For the nobility, fox tossing wasn't just about fun, it was a display of power and precision. The sport required impeccable teamwork, timing, and strength, turning what sounds like madness into a bizarre test of skill. The higher the fox soared, the greater the bragging rights. Some accounts even describe specially designed slings or trampoline-like contraptions to maximize the spectacle, proving this wasn't some spontaneous lark but a carefully orchestrated event. The choice of foxes wasn't random either. These clever, agile animals were seen as pests by the aristocracy, who often blamed them for raiding chicken coops or causing mischief on their estates. Tossing them became a twisted form of pest control mixed with theatrical flair. Yet records suggest the foxes rarely survived the ordeal, making it a grim reminder of how differently medieval elites viewed animal welfare compared to today. What's truly fascinating is how fox tossing reflected the extravagance of noble life. While peasants amused themselves with rough and tumble games, the aristocracy turned even their leisure into a display of dominance. Imagine the scene: finely dressed lords and ladies laughing as foxes sailed through the air, their lavish surroundings contrasting starkly with the brutality of the sport. It was entertainment designed to impress, shock, and reinforce social hierarchies. But fox tossing wasn't just confined to foxes. Some variations used other small animals, badgers, rabbits, even squirrels, though foxes remained the star attraction. The more ambitious events even featured multiple teams competing in tournaments, with prizes for the most impressive launches. It's a chilling glimpse into a world where power and privilege often trumped empathy, where the bizarre became ordinary simply because those in charge declared it so. This peculiar game eventually faded into obscurity, but its legacy lingers as a stark example of how far entertainment has evolved. Today, the very idea of fox tossing seems unthinkable, a relic of a time when cruelty and spectacle were uncomfortably intertwined. Yet it's also a reminder of humanity's capacity for reinvention, a proof that even the strangest traditions can be left behind as societies grow and change. Shrove-tide football wasn't just a game, it was an all-out war disguised as sport. Imagine hundreds of players from rival villages or neighborhoods flooding the streets, chasing a single ball or whatever passed for one. Pig bladders stuffed with air and stitched tight were the most common, but rocks, sacks of grain, or even wooden blocks could stand in if the ball was lost in the frenzy. There were no teams in the modern sense, no referees, and certainly no rules beyond one simple objective: get the ball to your side's designated goal, no matter the cost. The playing field, the entire town, streets, alleys, rivers, even people's homes were fair game as the mob surged back and forth, trampling everything in its path. Shopkeepers boarded up windows, mothers yanked children indoors, and bystanders either joined the fray or scrambled out of the way. This wasn't a match, it was a riot with a ball somewhere in the middle. Injuries were so common that local records often listed broken bones and gashes as just another Shrove-tide expense. Why would anyone willingly dive into such madness? For medieval communities, this wasn't just about competition, it was a release valve. Shrove-tide football took place in the days leading up to Lent, a period of fasting and solemnity. The game let people burn off steam in the most primal way possible, a sanctioned outlet for pent-up energy and rivalries. Villages settled grudges through brute force, young men proved their toughness, and everyone else either cheered or ran for cover. The chaos had meaning, though. Beneath the surface, Shrove-tide football reinforced community bonds. The goals were often landmarks with deep local significance: a specific mill, a church door, or a creek boundary. Winning meant defending your home turf, literally, and while the brawling was fierce, it was also fleeting. Once the game ended, usually at dusk or when everyone collapsed from exhaustion, rivals shared drinks and laughed over the day's disasters. The same hands that had shoved you into a ditch now passed you a tankard of ale. Modern sports fans might shudder at the lack of structure, but there's something oddly pure about Shrove-tide football's anarchy. No sponsors, no penalties, just raw, unfiltered competition where the only rule was win or be trampled. It was a reminder that games didn't need stadiums or rulebooks to matter. Sometimes all they needed was a crowd, a ball, and a shared hunger for glorious, reckless fun. Bear baiting was the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster event, an adrenaline-fueled spectacle that packed town squares with roaring crowds, all hungry for a taste of raw, unfiltered drama. At the center of it all stood a chained bear, often exhausted and scarred from previous fights, surrounded by snarling dogs trained to attack without mercy. The rules were simple. Spectators bet on how long the bear could hold out against the relentless onslaught, or which dog would land the final, brutal blow. It wasn't just a game, it was a test of endurance, cruelty, and the dark side of human entertainment. Why did this gruesome pastime captivate medieval audiences? For starters, bear baiting was a visceral display of power, both the bear's raw strength and the dog's coordinated ferocity. The bear, though chained, could still swipe a dog into the air with a single paw, sending the crowd into gasps or cheers. Meanwhile, the dogs, usually breeds like mastiffs or bulldogs bred for tenacity, fought with terrifying persistence, lunging at the bear's legs and throat. Every snap of jaws, every roar of pain was met with bets, shouts, and thunderous applause. But bear baiting wasn't just about bloodshed. It was a social event, a way for people from all walks of life to gather and share in the thrill. Nobles sat in raised galleries, placing lavish wagers, while peasants jostled for a view near the pit, their coins clutched tight. The spectacle even had a theatrical edge. Some organizers dressed the bears in costumes or staged mock battles, blurring the line between sport and performance. For a society with few diversions, the raw intensity of these fights was irresistible. The bears themselves were tragic figures, often captured as cubs and subjected to a life of torment. Traveling showmen hauled them from town to town, their chains a constant reminder of their captivity. Yet, in a twisted way, they became local celebrities. Regulars at fairs might recognize a particular bear by name, cheering for their favorite like modern fans rooting for a sports team. The irony was cruel. These animals were both adored and abused, their suffering the very thing that made them stars. What's most unsettling is how accepted bear baiting was. Clergy, merchants, even royalty attended without a second thought. Queen Elizabeth I was famously fond of the sport, hosting elaborate baiting events at her palaces. To medieval minds, animals existed for human use, whether for labor, food, or amusement. The idea of cruelty simply didn't register in the same way it does today. Yet bear baiting's popularity couldn't last forever. By the 17th century, growing moral unease fueled by religious reformers and early animal welfare advocates began to turn the tide. Laws slowly banned the practice, though underground fights persisted for years. Looking back, it's a stark reminder of how entertainment evolves. What once drew cheers now draws disgust, proving that even the most entrenched traditions can fade when society chooses compassion over cruelty. But the legacy of bear baiting lingers in unexpected ways. Modern bullfights, dog races, and even some extreme sports echo that same hunger for risk and spectacle. The difference today, we debate the ethics. Back then, the only question was who would win, the bear, the dogs, or the crowd's insatiable appetite for drama. Cock throwing was one of those medieval games that makes modern audiences wince, a brutal contest where roosters, tied to posts or buried up to their necks, became targets for hurled sticks and stones. The rules were as simple as they were cruel, the last bird still standing after the barrage won, though victory was a hollow concept for the battered animals. Crowds gathered eagerly, cheering with each hit, treating the suffering of these creatures as nothing more than light-hearted entertainment. What's chilling is how ordinary this seemed at the time. Unlike bear baiting, which at least had an air of grandeur, cock throwing was a casual pastime, played in village squares and tavern yards with the same nonchalance as a dice game. Roosters were cheap, plentiful, and loud qualities that made them perfect for this grim sport. Their strutting defiance turned into desperate struggles as projectiles rained down, and the more the birds flailed, the louder the crowd roared. But why roosters? In medieval Europe, these birds were more than just livestock, they were symbols. Their crowing marked the dawn, their aggression made them natural fighters, and their presence on farms was so ubiquitous that they became easy targets for sport. Some historians suggest the game had roots in old superstitions, where harming a rooster was thought to ward off evil spirits. Others argue it was just an excuse for young men to show off their aim while blowing off steam. Either way, the cruelty was baked into the tradition. What's striking is how little remorse accompanied the violence. Records from the time describe cock throwing with casual detachment, as if it were no different than a game of horseshoes. Church festivals, fairs, even Shrove-tide celebrations often featured it, with participants shrugging off the brutality as part of life's rough pleasures. Animals were seen as resources, not beings deserving compassion, and their pain was trivialized for the sake of amusement. Yet cock throwing wasn't mindless chaos, it had a twisted strategy. Skilled throwers aimed for the head to end the bird's resistance quickly, while others prolonged the spectacle by targeting wings or legs, ensuring the rooster suffered longer. Bets flew faster than the sticks, with spectators wagering on which bird would fall first or how many throws it would take to finish one off. The line between game and grotesque theater blurred entirely. By the 18th century, attitudes began to shift. Enlightenment thinkers and early animal welfare advocates condemned the practice, and laws slowly erased it from public life. Today, the idea of cock throwing is unthinkable, a relic of a time when cruelty was casual, but its legacy lingers as a reminder entertainment isn't neutral. It reflects who we are, what we tolerate, and how far we're willing to go in the name of fun. The fact that such a game ever existed tells us less about the past and more about humanity's capacity for change. Hot Cockles might sound like a strange dish, but it was actually one of medieval Europe's most peculiar party games, a mix of slapstick humor and outright brutality. Picture this, a blindfolded player kneeling in the center of a room, hands behind their back, completely vulnerable as friends and family took turns delivering sharp slaps to their head or back. The goal, guess who struck you, get it wrong, and the punishment continued, get it right, and the slapper took your place, sounds more like an interrogation than a game, doesn't it? This wasn't just mindless roughhousing, though. Hot Cockles had rules, bizarre as they were. The slaps had to be firm enough to sting but not hard enough to injure, though accidents definitely happened. Laughter was just as important as the pain, with players often disguising their voices or creeping up silently to keep the victim guessing. The tension of waiting for the next blow turned the game into a twisted test of nerve, where every smack was met with gasps, giggles, or groans from the crowd. Why would anyone volunteer for such treatment? In a world without television or internet, people made their own fun, often pushing boundaries to feel alive. Hot Cockles was a way to break social tension, a shared experience where everyone, young and old, noble and peasant, could participate on equal footing. The blindfolded player's humiliation was temporary, and the slapper's power was fleeting, creating a strange balance where no one was truly in control for long. But there was a deeper layer to the chaos. The game mirrored medieval life's unpredictability. One moment you're safe, the next you're blindsided by forces beyond your control. It was a physical metaphor for fate's cruel jokes, wrapped in the guise of entertainment. And just like life, the only way to win was to endure, adapt, and maybe laugh through the sting. Some historians believe Hot Cockles had roots in ancient rituals, where pain was thought to purify or ward off evil spirits. Others argue it was simply a way to let off steam in a society where hardship was constant. Whatever its origins, the game's popularity endured for centuries, showing up in taverns, manor houses, and even royal courts. Queen Mary of Scots supposedly played a version during her imprisonment, a grim reminder that even the powerful weren't immune to life's sudden blows. What's fascinating is how the game evolved. By the 18th century, Hot Cockles had softened into a children's pastime, with gentle taps replacing harsh slaps. The cruelty faded, but the core idea remained a game where trust, guesswork, and a little discomfort created bonds. Today, it feels unthinkable, a relic of a time when pain and play were uncomfortably close. But it's also a reminder, entertainment doesn't need to be kind to be memorable. Sometimes the games that stick with us are the ones that leave a mark, literally. Quintain was the medieval equivalent of a high-stakes carnival game, except instead of winning a stuffed animal, you risked getting clobbered by a swinging sandbag. Imagine a wooden dummy mounted on a rotating post, one arm holding a shield and the other a heavy counterweight. Knights on horseback would charge at full speed, lance aimed squarely at the shield. Strike it cleanly and the Quintain spun gracefully out of the way. Miss, that sandbag came whipping around with enough force to knock you clean off your saddle. This wasn't just reckless fun, it was serious training disguised as entertainment. Young knights practiced accuracy, timing, and reflexes, knowing a single misjudgment could send them tumbling into the dirt. The crowds loved it, of course. There's something universally hilarious about watching an overconfident nobleman get humbled by a chunk of swinging lumber. Townsfolk placed bets on how many riders would eat dust before someone landed a perfect hit. But the Quintain wasn't just for knights. Variations popped up across Europe, adapting to local tastes. Some versions replaced the sandbag with a water-filled bucket, drenching unlucky riders. Others had the dummy shaped like a Turk or Saracen, turning the exercise into a mock battle against a fictional foe. The church even got in on the action, hosting Quintain tournaments during festivals, where the spectacle of armored men getting walloped by a wooden arm was considered wholesome fun. What made this game endure wasn't just the schadenfreude, it was the sheer unpredictability. Unlike jousting, where skill usually triumphed, the Quintain kept everyone guessing. A seasoned knight could still misjudge the angle and take a sandbag to the ribs, while a beginner might fluke a perfect strike and become the day's unlikely hero. That tension between control and chaos was the heart of its appeal. By the Renaissance, the Quintain faded as warfare evolved, but its spirit lived on. Modern rodeos, obstacle courses, even carnival strength testers owe a little debt to this medieval death trap of a game. It proved a simple truth. Nothing bonds a crowd like watching someone face the consequences of their own mistakes, especially when those consequences swing back at them at full speed. Stoolball might look like cricket's clumsy cousin at first glance, but this deceptively simple game was a medieval favorite that blended strategy, skill, and a healthy dose of rural ingenuity. Picture a sunlit field where villagers gathered around a three-legged stool, the makeshift wicket that stood as the game's centerpiece. The rules were straightforward. One player defended the stool with a bat, often just a curved stick or a flat wooden paddle, while others took turns bowling an underhand pitch, aiming to knock the stool over. Succeed and the defender was out. Fail and the batter scored runs by dashing to a marker and back before the ball could be retrieved. What made Stoolball special was its accessibility. Unlike jousting or bear baiting, which required expensive equipment or trained animals, this was a game anyone could play with whatever was lying around. The ball might be a leather-wrapped lump of wool, a carved wooden sphere, or even a hardened clump of rags. No two matches were alike, adapting to the whims of the players and the materials at hand. And while it was gentler than the bloodier spectacles of the era, don't mistake it for tame. Competition could get fierce, especially when rival villages faced off. The game's charm lay in its improvisation. Without strict rules, local variations flourished. Some versions allowed defenders to hit the ball in any direction, turning the field into a chaotic free-for-all. Others added extra stools or markers, creating obstacles that demanded quick thinking and agility. Churchyards, tavern greens, and even bustling market squares became impromptu playing fields, with spectators cheering as batters dodged projectiles or slid home just in time. But Stoolball wasn't just fun, it was stealthy training. Historians believe it helped develop hand-eye coordination and reflexes, skills useful for everything from archery to farming. Young men honed their timing to swat away incoming pitches, while the bowlers practiced precision, learning to curve throws around defenses. Even women joined in, making it one of the few medieval sports where mixed participation was common. By the 17th century, Stoolball's influence was undeniable. It evolved into early forms of cricket and rounders, games that would eventually spawn modern baseball. Yet its legacy isn't just in rule books, it's in the spirit of community play. In a world where entertainment often divided people by class or violence, Stoolball brought them together. No grandstands, no wagering, just neighbors laughing as someone tripped over the stool or a well-aimed throw sent the batter scrambling. That's the magic of medieval games at their best. They didn't need polish or professionalism to captivate. Sometimes all it took was a stool, a ball, and the shared joy of seeing what happened next. If Shrovetide football was chaos on land, mob hockey was its frozen counterpart, a bone-jarring, ice-bound free-for-all where entire villages clashed with sticks, skates, and zero regard for personal safety. Picture a frozen river or pond transformed into a battlefield, with dozens of players from rival communities scrambling after a makeshift puck, often just a chunk of wood or a hardened lump of leather. There were no teams, no referees, and certainly no penalties for elbows to the ribs or sticks to the shins. The only rule: get the puck to the opposing village marker, even if it meant plowing through a human wall to do it. The brutality of mob hockey was legendary. Players skated, or more accurately, slid across uneven ice, their blades little more than sharpened bones or metal strips strapped to boots. Without the smooth glides of modern rinks, every movement was a gamble, and collisions sent bodies flying into snowbanks or through thin ice. Broken bones and gashes were so common that locals joked the real sport was seeing who could limp home without passing out from the pain. And with temperatures often below freezing, the cold acted as a crude anesthetic, numbing injuries until the adrenaline wore off. Why subject yourself to such mayhem? For medieval villagers, mob hockey wasn't just a game, it was a survival test. The sport honed skills crucial for icy winters, balance on slippery surfaces, endurance in harsh conditions, and the sheer grit to keep going when every muscle screamed to quit. It also settled rivalries. Winning meant bragging rights for your village, proof that your people were tougher, faster, and more relentless. Losers, they'd spend the next year hearing about it in taverns and market squares. The game's roots were practical too. Before organized sports, communities repurposed tools for play. Sticks meant for herding became hockey clubs, and frozen waterways, usually just routes for trade or travel, doubled as arenas. Even the puck's unpredictability mirrored life's hardships. It might bounce off a rock, sink into slush, or vanish under snow, forcing players to adapt on the fly. What's fascinating is how mob hockey mirrored the raw, communal spirit of medieval life. Unlike noble tournaments with their chivalric codes, this was a sport where farmers, blacksmiths, and fishermen could outshine the local lord's men. It didn't matter if you owned land or slept in a barn. If you could swing a stick and take a hit, you were in. The game's democracy was its charm, a rare space where status mattered less than sheer determination. By the 19th century, mob hockey's wilder edges were sanded down into the organized sport we know today. But its legacy lives on in every slap shot and body check, a reminder that sometimes the best games aren't just played, they're survived. Skittles wasn't just a medieval version of bowling. It was a raucous, high-energy pastime where luck, skill, and a healthy dose of tavern rivalry collided. Imagine a dusty courtyard behind a bustling alehouse, where wooden pins stood like silent sentinels, waiting to be toppled by a well-aimed roll. The balls themselves were far from the polished spheres of modern lanes. They were often lumpy, hand-carved from hardwoods, or even cobbled together from stone, their uneven weight making every throw a gamble. Players didn't just compete for bragging rights, they wagered coins, drinks, even next week's wages on the outcome, turning a simple game into a nail-biting spectacle. But Skittles had a twist that set it apart from today's bowling alleys. The pins weren't always arranged in neat triangles. Some versions used a single kingpin, and knocking it down required precision, not just power. Others placed the pins in a circle with the goal of sending them flying outward like spokes from a wheel. And then there were the regional quirks. Some towns used cheese wheels as balls, while others insisted the pins had to be struck with a spinning underhand toss, adding a layer of finesse to the brute force. Tavern keepers loved Skittles because it kept patrons drinking and spending. A losing player might buy the next round, while a winner could walk away with a pouch full of silver. The game became so tied to gambling that authorities occasionally tried to ban it, accusing players of neglecting work or squandering family fortunes. But bans rarely stuck. Skittles was too ingrained in social life, a way to bond, brag, and blow off steam after a long week in the fields or workshops. What's fascinating is how the game mirrored medieval society's contradictions. On one hand, it was a test of skill where practice and strategy paid off. On the other, it was a reminder that luck could upend the best-laid plans, a theme that resonated in an era where harvests, health, and survival often hinged on chance. The tavern crowd roared just as loudly for a fluke victory as they did for a masterful strike, celebrating the chaos as much as the control. By the 17th century, Skittles had evolved into more standardized forms, but its spirit never faded. Today, when you hear the clatter of pins in a bowling alley, you're hearing echoes of those rowdy medieval courtyards, where every roll carried the weight of a wager and the thrill of the unexpected. It's proof that some games don't just entertain, they capture the messy, glorious unpredictability of being human. Human chess was the ultimate medieval power play, a living, breathing spectacle where nobles didn't just move pieces on a board, they became them. Imagine a courtyard transformed into a colossal chessboard, with lords and ladies draped in elaborate costumes, each embroidered to represent kings, queens, knights, or pawns. At a noble's command, they'd stride forward in precise formations, their every step a performance of wealth and control. But this wasn't just a fancy pantomime. Some versions of the game came with very real stakes. Lose a piece in battle, that captured noble might find themselves forfeiting land, titles, or even facing public humiliation. The game's brilliance lay in its dual purpose. On the surface, it was a test of strategy, with players maneuvering their human pieces just like wooden ones, plotting attacks and defenses across the board. But beneath that, it was a flex, an ostentatious display of who could afford the most extravagant costumes, the most obedient servants, and the most lavish venue. The richer the host, the grander the spectacle. Think velvet-clad bishops, knights in gilded armor, and queens trailing silks that cost more than a peasant's yearly earnings. Every detail, from the size of the board to the choreography of the pieces, screamed status, and then there were the consequences. In some accounts, captured nobles weren't just removed from play, they were subjected to playful or not so playful penalties. A knight might have to recite poetry to the court, a pawn could be forced to serve drinks to the winning side, and on rare occasions, the loser's lands might change hands. It was all technically voluntary, of course, but refusing to participate, that was its own kind of social suicide. The game blurred the line between entertainment and political theater, where every move could ripple through real-life alliances and rivalries. What's fascinating is how human chess mirrored the rigid hierarchies of medieval society. The pieces' movements were dictated by their rank. Pawns couldn't stride like queens, just as peasants couldn't ascend to nobility. Yet, for a brief moment during the game, even the lowest-ranking participants shared the spotlight, their role essential to the spectacle. It was a rare glimpse of interdependence in a world obsessed with division. By the Renaissance, human chess had evolved into more symbolic displays, losing its sharper edges, but its legacy lingers in modern reenactments and even pop culture. Think of the life-sized wizard's chess in Harry Potter or the dramatic political maneuvering in Game of Thrones. Both owe a debt to those medieval nobles who turned a board game into a battlefield of silk and strategy, proving that sometimes the most powerful moves aren't made with pieces but with people. Whipping tops might sound like child's play, but in medieval Europe, this deceptively simple game became an obsession for all ages. Picture a village square alive with the rhythmic crack of whips and the hum of spinning wooden tops, their polished surfaces glinting in the sunlight as competitors circled them like predators. The rules were straightforward. Use a leather-tipped whip to keep your top spinning longer than anyone else's, but mastering it required a blend of precision, timing, and sheer endurance. One wrong flick and your top would wobble, stagger, and finally collapse in the dirt while rivals jeered. What made this game so irresistible? For starters, it was accessible. Unlike jousting or archery, which demanded expensive equipment, whipping tops required nothing more than a carved wooden top and a makeshift whip. Children fashioned theirs from sticks and frayed rope, while adults might invest in sturdier models, their whips tipped with scraps of hardened leather for maximum control. The real magic, though, lay in the physics. A well-balanced top could spin for minutes if struck just right, its movement hypnotizing bystanders as it carved delicate circles in the earth. But whipping tops wasn't just about keeping a toy upright. It was a subtle test of skill disguised as play. The best players knew exactly where and how hard to strike, adjusting their technique as the top's momentum waned. Too gentle and the top would slow, too harsh and it might careen off course or even shatter on impact. Veterans of the game developed calloused hands and a keen eye for spin patterns, their wrists flicking with the practiced ease of blacksmiths hammering steel. The social aspect turned it into a spectacle. Taverns hosted impromptu tournaments where patrons bet ale on whose top would outlast the others. Markets became battlegrounds, with merchants pausing their haggling to cheer on local champions. Even nobles dabbled, though their ornate tops, sometimes inlaid with ivory or painted in family colors, were more for show than utility. The game's beauty was its democracy. A peasant's rough-hewn top could outspin a lord's gilded toy, proving that skill trumped wealth. Beneath the surface, whipping tops carried deeper symbolism. The spinning motion fascinated medieval minds, echoing the cyclical nature of seasons, life, and even the cosmos. Some scholars linked it to ancient rituals meant to summon good harvests or ward off evil spirits. Others saw it as a metaphor for fate, how a single, well-placed strike could alter destiny's course. Whether players thought about these connections or not, the game's meditative rhythm offered a rare moment of focus in an unpredictable world. By the Renaissance, whipping tops had evolved into more refined forms, eventually inspiring modern games like spinning tops and even gyroscopes. But its medieval heyday remains a testament to humanity's love for simple pleasures, the thrill of competition, the joy of mastery, and the universal delight of watching something ordinary spin into something extraordinary. Hoodman's Blind was medieval Europe's answer to a comedy show, a riotous game where misfortune was the main attraction. Imagine a player stumbling blindly through a crowded courtyard, their hood yanked backward to block all vision, arms outstretched as they swiped at laughter and taunts. Every misstep sent them crashing into barrels, tripping over dogs, or colliding with unsuspecting bystanders, while the other participants darted just out of reach, poking the hooded figure or yanking their sleeves before vanishing into the chaos. It was tag turned into pure slapstick, and audiences couldn't get enough. The rules were simple but brutal. The Hoodman had to rely entirely on sound and touch to catch another player, who'd then inherit the hood and its humiliations. But the real fun came from the creative torment. Some versions let players strike the Hoodman with soft sacks or tickle them as they passed, heightening the disorientation. Others added obstacles like low benches or scattered hay bales, turning the game into an obstacle course of impending faceplants. The more absurd the failure, the harder the crowd roared, especially when nobility joined in. Watching a lord or lady fumble helplessly leveled the social playing field, if only for a few hilarious minutes. Why did this game endure for centuries? Because it tapped into something universal, the joy of harmless mischief. In a world where daily life was often harsh and predictable, Hoodman's Blind offered a rare chance to revel in chaos. Children loved it for the adrenaline rush, adults for the nostalgia, and everyone for the sheer spectacle. Even Chaucer referenced it in the Canterbury Tales, proving its grip on the medieval imagination. But there was strategy beneath the silliness. Clever hoodmen learned to listen for breathing or footsteps, while crafty evaders used misdirection, clapping from one direction while sneaking away in another. The game sharpened reflexes and spatial awareness skills useful beyond the playing field. And unlike brutal blood sports, Hoodman's Blind left participants bruised only in pride, making it one of the few medieval pastimes where laughter outweighed pain. Its legacy lives on in modern games like blindfolded tag or pin the tail on the donkey, but the original had an edge those sanitized versions lack. Hoodman's Blind wasn't just play. It was a reminder that sometimes the best way to endure life's uncertainties is to laugh at them, preferably while someone in a backward hood trips over a chicken. Stinging nettles wrestling took medieval masochism to new heights, literally. Imagine a pit filled waist-deep with those infamous plants, their tiny, needle-like hairs primed to inject skin with burning chemicals upon contact. Now picture two competitors wading into that green nightmare, bare-chested and grinning through gritted teeth, ready to grapple until one surrendered or collapsed from the agony. This wasn't just a test of strength, it was a battle against biology itself, where victory came with a side of searing pain and weeks of itching misery. The rules were as brutal as they were simple. No protective clothing, no time limits, just raw endurance. Wrestlers locked arms, twisted and shoved, their every movement driving the nettles deeper into their flesh. The sting set in fast, a fiery sensation that could feel like hundreds of ants biting simultaneously. Some accounts describe participants turning blotchy red within minutes, their skin swelling into angry welts as the crowd cheered them onward. The last person left standing, still fighting through the torment, earned more than bragging rights. They proved something primal, that pain could be conquered, or at least endured longer than your rival's tolerance. Why would anyone volunteer for such torture? For medieval communities, this wasn't just about entertainment, it was a rite of passage. Young men used it to prove their toughness, their ability to withstand hardship in an era where life itself was often painful. Villages held these contests during harvest festivals or solstice celebrations, turning suffering into spectacle. The crowd's role was crucial. Their jeers could shame a quitter, while their cheers might push a wavering wrestler to ignore the burning and press on. But there was strategy beneath the suffering. Clever wrestlers learned to minimize contact with the plants by keeping their opponent beneath them, using their rival's body as a shield against the nettles. Others embraced the pain, knowing their tolerance might outlast their adversaries. The plants themselves added unpredictability. Some patches were denser or more potent, turning the pit into a cruel lottery where one misstep could mean unbearable agony. The aftermath was its own kind of ordeal. Winners limped away with rashes that could last for days, their skin peeling or blistering. Folk remedies abounded: dockside leaves rubbed on the welts, vinegar baths, or even urine, a dubious medieval cure-all. Yet many returned year after year, wearing their scars like badges of honor. Stinging nettles wrestling faded as modern sensibilities took hold, but its legacy lingers in extreme sports today. From firewalking to obstacle courses designed to punish, humanity's fascination with voluntary suffering hasn't vanished, it's just evolved. The medieval version, though, it remains one of history's most visceral reminders. Sometimes the most unforgettable games aren't about who's strongest, but who can endure the unendurable. Duck hunting on horseback was the medieval equivalent of a high-speed water rodeo, a chaotic, splash-filled spectacle where knights turned ponds into battlegrounds and ducks into unwilling targets. Picture armored riders charging through shallow waters, their horses kicking up spray as they swung wooden clubs at panicked ducks darting across the surface. The goal wasn't just to hit the birds, it was to stun them just enough to scoop them up, all while staying mounted on a spooked horse slippery with mud and algae. This wasn't hunting for survival, it was hunting for sport, where the real prize was proving who could master the absurd combination of speed, balance, and brute force. What made this game so challenging was the sheer unpredictability. Ducks, being decidedly uncooperative participants, would dive, flutter, or zigzag the moment a club came swinging. Horses, already uneasy about wading into water, would balk at the flapping chaos, leaving riders clinging to their saddles mid-swing. A well-timed hit required perfect timing. Too early, and the duck escaped; too late, and the knight might overbalance and tumble into the drink. The crowd's roar would crescendo with every near miss or spectacular spill, turning what looked like a simple game into a slapstick struggle against nature. But why ducks? These birds were abundant in medieval Europe, thriving in ponds and marshes near castles and villages. They were agile enough to make the hunt exciting, but not so fast that success was impossible. Plus, capturing them alive meant the game could be repeated. Ducks were often released back into the water for the next round, though probably with a newfound distrust of humans on horses. The sport also doubled as elite training. Knights honed their horsemanship in conditions far trickier than open fields, learning to control their mounts through uneven terrain and sudden movements. Swinging a club while knee-deep in water demanded core strength and coordination, skills that translated directly to battlefield maneuvers. And let's be honest, there's no better way to impress a crowd than by emerging victorious from what essentially amounted to a joust against waterfowl. By the Renaissance, duck hunting on horseback had faded, replaced by more civilized pastimes like falconry. But its spirit lives on in modern rodeo events or even viral challenges where balance and precision collide. It's a reminder that medieval entertainment wasn't just about violence or valor sometimes. It was about embracing the ridiculous and seeing who could keep their dignity afloat. Stone bowling turned medieval strength and accuracy into a high-stakes spectator sport, one where the weight of the rock was just as important as the skill of the throw. Imagine a village square packed with onlookers, their eyes fixed on a single target, maybe a wooden stake driven into the dirt or a chalk circle drawn on the ground. Competitors hefted smooth, heavy stones, some weighing as much as a small child, and with a grunt of effort sent them rolling across the uneven terrain. The goal: land closest to the mark without overshooting or veering wildly off course. Simple in theory, brutally difficult in practice. Unlike modern bowling, where polished lanes and identical balls ensure fairness, stone bowling was a test of adaptability. Every throw was a negotiation with the environment. A stone might hit a hidden divot and lurch sideways, or gain unexpected speed on a downhill slope. Players had to read the ground like farmers assessing soil, adjusting their stance and force to compensate for bumps, mud, or patches of loose gravel. The best throwers weren't just strong, they were strategists, calculating angles and momentum like medieval physicists. The stones themselves became prized possessions, carefully selected for balance and heft. Some were passed down through generations, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of hands. Others were locally famous, like the Devil's Egg of Yorkshire, a nearly spherical rock said to never roll straight, no matter how skilled the thrower. Betting on outcomes was rampant, with wagers ranging from pints of ale to parcels of land. A well-known stone bowler could become a village celebrity, their reputation built on the ability to tame chaos with a single, well-placed roll. What's fascinating is how this game doubled as covert training. The strength required to hurl heavy stones translated directly to tasks like plowing fields or hauling timber. Precision mattered in trades like masonry or carpentry, where a poorly placed strike could ruin hours of work. Even children played scaled-down versions, preparing for adulthood through what looked like play. By the Renaissance, stone bowling evolved into more refined lawn games like box and pétanque, but its medieval roots were pure grit. No fancy courts, no standardized equipment, just raw competition against the elements. In a world where life was unpredictable, stone bowling was a reminder. Sometimes you roll with what you've got and hope luck favors your aim. Goose pulling was medieval entertainment at its most brutal, a test of strength, horsemanship, and sheer ruthlessness that blurred the line between sport and spectacle. Picture a live goose, its neck heavily greased with lard or soap, dangling upside down from a rope stretched across a road or between two trees. Riders on horseback would charge at full speed, reaching up to grab the bird's slippery neck as they passed. The goal: tear the head clean off in one swift motion, and if you succeeded, the mangled prize was yours to keep. This wasn't just a crude contest of force, it was a twisted showcase of skill. The grease made the goose's neck nearly impossible to grip, forcing riders to time their grabs perfectly or risk sliding off empty-handed. Horses, unsettled by the flapping wings and the scent of fear, often shied away at the last second, sending their riders clawing at air. The crowd's reaction was equally volatile. Cheers erupted for a clean decapitation, while near misses drew groans or laughter. And the goose, it rarely survived the first few attempts, but the game continued until its head finally came loose, the victor galloping away with a grim trophy. Why would communities embrace something so vicious? For medieval peasants, goose pulling was more than just a game. It was a twisted metaphor for life's struggles. The greased neck symbolized elusive rewards, whether a good harvest, a lucky break, or simply surviving another winter. Wresting something valuable from a world that gave nothing freely resonated deeply. Meanwhile, for the nobility, it was a chance to flaunt their horsemanship, proving they could master even the most grotesque challenges. Regional variations added layers to the cruelty. Some versions used a dead goose to prolong the sport, while others tied the bird to a sliding ring, making it bounce unpredictably as riders charged. In parts of Spain and France, the game evolved into coleo, where riders dragged calves by the tail, a slightly less gruesome but equally controversial tradition that survives today in some rodeos. The backlash was inevitable. As early as the 17th century, clergy and reformers condemned goose pulling as barbaric, and by the industrial age, it had largely vanished from public view. But its legacy lingers in modern debates about animal welfare and the ethics of tradition. What once passed for amusement now serves as a stark reminder. Entertainment evolves, but humanity's capacity for cruelty and our ability to outgrow it is a story still being written. Natalica was the Viking answer to modern extreme sports, a bone-jarring, teeth-rattling ball game where the only rule was that there were no rules. Picture a frozen Icelandic field under a pale winter sun, two teams of burly Norsemen armed with wooden bats chasing a rock-hard leather ball across the ice. The objective: get the ball past the opposing team's goal line by any means necessary. And by any means, we mean full body tackles, strategic shoves into snowbanks, and the occasional friendly whack with a bat if someone got too handsy with the ball. This wasn't just a game, it was a trial by combat disguised as recreation. What made Natalica so uniquely brutal was the playing surface. Ice and packed snow turned every sprint into a potential slip and slide disaster, adding an extra layer of chaos to the already violent gameplay. Players wore thick wool and leather for padding, but nothing could fully cushion the impact of a grown Viking slamming into you at full speed. Broken bones were so common that sagas, the Viking equivalent of history books, mention warriors recovering from Natalica injuries before returning to actual battles. That's right, this game was considered worse than war wounds in some cases. But Natalica wasn't just about brute force, it demanded strategy. Teams had to coordinate like shield walls on a battlefield, using feints and formations to outmaneuver opponents. The bats weren't just for hitting the ball, they doubled as makeshift weapons to block rivals or accidentally trip them up, and the ball itself. Some historians believe it was stuffed with horsehair or gravel, making it less of a ball and more of a projectile weapon. Getting hit in the face with one could knock you out cold, turning the game into a last man standing brawl. The social stakes were just as high as the physical ones. Natalica matches often settled village disputes or decided leadership roles, with the winning team earning bragging rights for years. Festivals revolved around these games, with crowds betting everything from livestock to swords on the outcome. Even women reportedly played in some regions, proving Viking society had a surprising egalitarian streak when it came to their favorite pastime. What's fascinating is how Natalica mirrored Viking values. The game rewarded toughness, teamwork, and quick thinking, the same traits that made a successful raider or chieftain. Boys grew up playing it to prepare for adulthood, learning to endure pain and outwit opponents long before they ever set foot on a longship. By the time Christianity spread through Scandinavia, Natalica faded into obscurity, deemed too violent for the new moral order. But its spirit lives on in modern sports like hockey or rugby, where controlled chaos still thrills crowds. The Vikings might be long gone, but their idea of fun, unyielding, unpredictable, and utterly unforgettable still echoes every time someone body checks an opponent into the boards. Camping might sound like a peaceful outdoor activity today, but in medieval times it was anything but serene. This was soccer's wild, untamed ancestor, where the only thing thicker than the mud was the chaos. Picture sprawling fields dotted with makeshift goals, often just a pair of sticks or piles of stones, as dozens of players from rival villages chased a leather-stuffed ball across miles of open terrain. Matches could stretch from dawn till dusk, with no strict boundaries, no referees, and certainly no substitutions. If you got tired, tough luck. You played until your legs gave out or the ball, if it even survived the ordeal, finally made it into a goal. What set camping apart from modern soccer was its beautiful anarchy. There were no offside rules, no penalty kicks, and no limits on how many players could swarm the ball at once. Entire villages would join in, turning the game into a moving scrum where elbows, shoulders, and the occasional stray kick were all fair play. The ball itself was a far cry from today's precision-engineered spheres, often just a pig's bladder wrapped in leather, prone to splitting open or getting lost in tall grass. Half the battle wasn't just scoring, it was keeping track of the ball amid the pandemonium. But camping wasn't just mindless roughhousing. It demanded endurance, teamwork, and a keen eye for opportunity. Players had to strategize on the fly, using the landscape to their advantage, kicking the ball downhill for extra momentum, or herding opponents into bogs to slow them down. The sheer size of the playing area meant speed alone wasn't enough. You needed stamina to outlast the pack. And since matches often coincided with festivals or holidays, the crowd's energy fueled the frenzy. Spectators would run alongside the players, shouting advice or tripping up rivals, blurring the line between audience and participant. The game's origins were deeply practical. Before organized sports, medieval Europeans repurposed everyday objects for play. A ball was easy to make, and open fields were plentiful, but camping also served as covert training. The running and kicking mirrored the physical demands of farming or herding, while the chaotic teamwork mirrored village life. Everyone had a role, and success depended on collective effort. Even the name hints at its roots. Camping likely comes from the Old English word campion, meaning to fight or strive. A fitting label for a game that felt more like a battle than a pastime. By the 19th century, camping had faded as standardized soccer rules emerged, taming the sport into the game we know today. But its spirit lives on in every pickup match where the rules are flexible and the stakes are purely for pride. It's a reminder that sometimes the best games aren't about structure, they're about sheer, unbridled joy. Even if it means leaving the field bruised, muddy, and grinning like a fool. Jousting at the Quintain was where knightly skill met slapstick humiliation, a training exercise so brutally effective that it doubled as crowd-pleasing entertainment. Picture a wooden dummy mounted on a rotating post, one arm extended with a shield and the other weighted with a heavy sandbag. A young knight, lance in hand, would charge at full gallop, aiming to strike the shield dead center. Success sent the Quintain spinning gracefully away, a testament to precision and control. But miss by even an inch, that counterweight came whipping around like a vengeful pendulum, ready to knock the overconfident rider straight into the dirt. This wasn't just hazing for new recruits, it was genius in its simplicity. The Quintain forced knights to master lance work under pressure, where a split-second error meant public embarrassment. The sandbag swing was unforgiving. It could catch a rider in the back, the helmet, or even the horse's flank, sending both tumbling in a clatter of armor and startled whinnies. Spectators loved it, cheering for clean hits and roaring with laughter at every disastrous miss. Local fairs often set up quintains for amateur attempts, where even peasants could try their hand and quickly learn why knights earned their status through years of grueling practice. What made the Quintain so valuable was its realism. Unlike static target practice, the moving arm mimicked the unpredictability of a real opponent. A knight had to account for timing, angle, and the recoil of his own strike, all while controlling a nervous warhorse. The best could hit the shield with enough force to spin the dummy without triggering the sandbag's wrath, a delicate balance of power and finesse, and the worst. They became cautionary tales, their spills recounted in taverns for years. Variations kept the challenge fresh, Some Quintains held buckets of water or flour, dousing clumsy riders in added humiliation. Others replaced the dummy with a human-like figure, often painted as a Moor or Saracen to stoke competitive fervor. In coastal regions, the game went aquatic knights jousted from boats, where the rocking waves turned an already tricky feat into a near-impossible spectacle. Quintain's legacy endures in modern equestrian sports and even carnival games, where the thrill of precision under pressure still captivates, but its medieval version remains unmatched, a reminder that the path to mastery wasn't just about glory. Sometimes it meant eating dirt while the crowd laughed, then climbing back in the saddle to try again. Hurling the silver ball was Cornwall's answer to full-contact treasure hunting, a marathon of mayhem where villages turned into battlegrounds over a single gleaming prize. Picture hundreds of players surging through fields, streets, and even rivers, all fighting to clutch a silver sphere no bigger than an apple. The rules were beautifully simple. Carry the ball to your team's designated goal, whether that meant a church porch, a millstone, or a specific tree. How you got it there, that was entirely up to you. Elbow your way through the mob, sprint miles in a diversionary feint, or simply tuck the ball under your shirt and vanish into the crowd like a smuggler with Contra, and the only crime was getting caught. What made this game legendary was its sheer scale. Matches could stretch for days, with players collapsing from exhaustion only to rejoin the fray after a few hours' rest. The ball changed hands constantly, snatched mid-sprint by a rival or pried loose in a wrestling match that spilled into the local creek. Strategy mattered as much as strength. Some teams formed human chains to pass the ball covertly, while others sent decoys sprinting in the wrong direction, drawing pursuers away like foxes chasing shadows. The chaos wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Blacksmiths abandoned their forges, fishermen left their nets, and even the local gentry waded into the scrum, their fine clothes torn and muddy by the end. The silver ball itself was no ordinary trinket. Crafted by skilled silversmiths, it symbolized community pride, often engraved with the year or the names of past winners. To hold it was to hold your village's honor, a fact that turned every scuffle into a miniature war. But the ball's real power lay in its neutrality. Unlike Shrove-tied football's makeshift pellets, this was a coveted artifact, kept under guard between games and paraded like a holy relic before play began. Its value meant no one dared damage it, so the violence stayed mostly human-focused. Why did this tradition endure for centuries? Because it was more than a game, it was a social equalizer. Rich or poor, young or old, everyone had a role. Fleet-footed youths could outrun burly farmers, while cunning elders plotted tactics from the sidelines. The game also reinforced village identities. Winning meant your home's name was etched into local lore, a bragging right that lasted until the next match. And unlike blood sports, hurling left no permanent scars, just sore muscles, hoarse voices, and stories that grew taller with each retelling. By the 19th century, the tradition faded as urbanization and stricter laws tamed such rowdy pastimes. But echoes remain in modern rugby scrums or the chaotic energy of capture the flag. Hurling the silver ball proved something timeless. When a community throws itself wholeheartedly into play, even a simple object can become the stuff of legend. Cudgeling was the medieval world's answer to a high-stakes boxing match, except instead of gloves, fighters swung thick wooden clubs, and the only way to win was to batter your opponent into submission. Picture two combatants circling each other in a dirt ring, their cudgels heavy, blunt sticks often reinforced with iron bands, gripped tight as the crowd roared for action. The rules were straightforward: strike anything above the waist, dodge or block incoming blows, and fight until one man yielded, collapsed, or could no longer lift his arms. No fancy footwork, no point system, just raw, unfiltered endurance where every thwack of wood against flesh echoed like a drumbeat of pain. What set cudgeling apart from mindless brawling was its surprising sophistication. This wasn't a tavern scrap, it was a disciplined test of timing, precision, and pain tolerance. Skilled fighters trained for years, mastering techniques to deflect strikes with their own club or twist their torso at the last second to minimize damage. The best could land a crippling blow to the forearm or shoulder, numbing their opponent's grip without breaking bones. Spectators placed bets not just on who'd win, but how. Would it be a swift knockout or a grueling war of attrition where both men staggered like drunkards before one finally crumpled? The sport's brutality masked its deeper cultural role. In an era where disputes often turned deadly, cudgeling offered a sanctioned outlet for violence. Neighbors with a feud could settle it in the ring, trading blood for lasting resolution. Young men proved their mettle in public matches, earning respect even in defeat if they withstood enough punishment without crying mercy. And for the nobility, it was a spectacle of controlled chaos, a way to showcase their martial prowess without the permanence of a sword duel. Some lords even kept professional cudgelers in their retinues, their scarred knuckles a badge of honor. But the real intrigue lay in the weapons themselves. A cudgel wasn't just a stick, it was a carefully balanced tool, often customized to the fighter's style. Shorter clubs favored quick, rib-shattering jabs, while longer ones allowed sweeping strikes to keep opponents at bay. Some were weighted at the tip for crushing force, others had leather-wrapped grips to prevent slipping when hands grew slick with sweat or blood. The craftsmanship mattered because in a contest where one well-placed blow could end the fight, the club became an extension of the fighter's will. The aftermath of a match was its own kind of theater. Winners might hoist their cudgel like a trophy, while losers were carried off by friends, their arms purple with bruises. Yet even in defeat, there was dignity. Walking away unaided after a beating earned respect, and the crowd's loudest cheers often went to the man who refused to quit, even as his legs buckled beneath him. By the 18th century, cudgeling faded as dueling swords and pistols replaced blunt weapons in settling disputes, but its legacy lingers in modern stick-fighting traditions like Irish batarat or Filipino arnis, proof that even the crudest games could forge a lasting martial art. More than just a sport, cudgeling was a brutal ballet where every swing carried the weight of honor, pride, and the unspoken truth. Sometimes the strongest man isn't the one who hits hardest, but the one who stands longest. Barley breaks turned the countryside into a playground of strategy and speed, a chaotic blend of tag and capture the flag where entire fields became battlegrounds for rival teams. Imagine groups of young adults sprinting through golden barley stalks, their laughter and shouts cutting through the summer air as they dodged, feinted, and lunged to catch opponents or reclaim their own captured players. The rules were simple but electrifying. Each team had a home base, often a tree, rock, or makeshift flag, and the goal was to invade enemy territory, tag as many rivals as possible, and drag them back to your side as prisoners. But here's the twist: if you got tagged on enemy ground, you were stuck there until a teammate rescued you by breaking through the opposition's defenses. What made Barley Break so thrilling was its perfect balance of brute force and cunning. Speed alone wouldn't win the game. Players had to coordinate ambushes, create diversions, and sometimes sacrifice themselves to free captured allies. The tall barley stalks added an extra layer of tension, hiding pursuers until the last second or providing cover for a stealthy escape. Local variations kept the game fresh. Some villages allowed prisoners to form human chains, stretching toward their teammates like a lifeline, while others decreed that only the fastest runner could attempt a jailbreak. This wasn't just a game, it was a social event disguised as play. Barley breaks often coincided with harvest festivals when communities had rare downtime to celebrate. Young men and women used it as a chance to show off their agility and bravery, with flirtatious rivalries sparking as much excitement as the competition itself. Elders would watch from the sidelines, placing bets on which team had the best tactics, while children mimicked the action in smaller, less chaotic versions of their own. The game's legacy lingers in modern capture the flag or even paintball, but its medieval version had a rawness that's hard to replicate. There were no safety zones or timeouts, just the exhilarating risk of being caught mid-sprint, the triumph of a last-second rescue, and the shared exhaustion as players collapsed in the grass at dusk, grinning through dirt-streaked faces. Barley breaks proved something timeless. Sometimes the simplest games, just a field, a few friends, and a competitive spark, create the most unforgettable adventures. Plank walking was medieval slapstick with a splash, literally. Imagine two competitors perched on a narrow wooden beam stretched precariously over a pit of murky water or thick mud, each armed with a long pole. The goal: stay balanced while using your weapon to poke, prod, or outright shove your rival into the drink below. One wrong move, and suddenly you're flailing midair before hitting the sludge with a spectacular splat, much to the delight of jeering spectators. This wasn't just a test of balance, it was a theatrical duel where dignity was the first casualty. What made this game so fiendishly entertaining was its simplicity. The planks were often barely wider than a man's foot, turning every step into a wobbling act of desperation. Add a rival jabbing at your knees or shoulders with a pole, and suddenly staying upright felt like defying gravity itself. Crowds loved the inevitable moment when overconfidence backfired. A bold lunge might send both combatants tumbling in a tangled heap, their poles clattering uselessly into the muck. Festivals and fairs embraced plank walking as a crowd pleaser, where the stakes were low unless you counted pride, but the laughter was guaranteed. But there was strategy beneath the silliness. Experienced players knew to keep their movements small and controlled, using their poles like tightrope walkers balancing sticks. Others relied on feints, pretending to lose footing to lure their opponent into a reckless strike. The surface beneath the plank added another layer of chaos. Water made for a humiliating but harmless splash, while thick mud meant struggling to extract yourself like a uprooted turnip, much to the crowd's amusement. The game's brilliance lay in its accessibility. Unlike jousting or archery, which required expensive gear, plank walking needed little more than a spare board and a willingness to embrace embarrassment. Peasants and nobles alike could compete, though the latter often opted for raised platforms to avoid soiling their finery, until a well-aimed poke sent them toppling anyway. It was a rare equalizer in a stratified society, proving that gravity and clumsiness didn't discriminate by class. Plank walking's legacy endures in modern obstacle courses and comedy shows, where the thrill of watching someone lose their balance never gets old. It reminds us that the simplest challenges, stay on, don't fall, can be the most universally entertaining, especially when the penalty for failure is a face full of mud and a chorus of laughter. Medieval games were far more than idle distractions. They were mirrors reflecting the values, fears, and aspirations of an entire era. In a world where survival was uncertain and life was often short, these pastimes offered a way to rehearse the skills that mattered most. Strength, endurance, and combat prowess weren't just admired. They were necessities, which is why so many games doubled as covert training. Jousting at the Quintain sharpened a knight's lance work for battle, while mob hockey's icy chaos prepared villagers for the physical demands of winter. Even the brutality of bear baiting or goose pulling echoed a harsh truth. medieval life was shaped by violence, and confronting it, whether in sport or spectacle, was a way to tame the unpredictable. Yet these games also revealed society's contradictions. For every bloody contest like cudgeling, there was a whimsical counterpart like Hoodman's blind, where laughter outweighed pain. The same culture that glorified fox tossing as aristocratic entertainment also cherished Stoolball, a game where peasants and nobility could compete on equal footing. This duality speaks volumes. In a rigidly hierarchical world, games became rare spaces where social lines blurred, if only temporarily. A lord might gamble alongside a blacksmith at Skittles, or a village girl could outwit a knight in Barley breaks. The playing field, however uneven in daily life, could become startlingly level when fun was at stake. Communal bonding was another thread woven through these pastimes. In an era without digital distractions, games were the glue holding villages together. Shrove-tide football's anarchic brawls might seem like pure chaos, but they also reinforced local identities, settling grudges through controlled conflict before Lent's austerity began. Hurling the silver ball transformed entire towns into teams where every participant, young or old, rich or poor, had a role. Even the rowdiest events ended with shared ale and storytelling, turning rivalry into camaraderie. Religion and ritual lurked beneath the surface too. Many games coincided with festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, like May Day or harvest celebrations. Plank-walking slippery challenges might have been a nod to the precariousness of fate, while stinging nettles wrestling mirrored the endurance required to survive lean winters. Some historians argue that the cruelty of animal-based sports had roots in ancient sacrificial rites, where suffering was thought to appease the divine. Whether sacred or profane, these games were threads in the fabric of daily life, connecting the mundane to the mystical. What's most striking is how medieval games channeled humanity's timeless cravings for competition, connection, and a dash of the extraordinary. They remind us that joy isn't a modern invention. Even in the shadow of hardship, people carved out moments of exhilaration, whether by launching a terrified fox into the air or simply staying upright on a greased plank. The games changed, but the impulse behind them didn't. Today's sports and pastimes are heirs to that same spirit, the need to test ourselves, to laugh together, and to find light in the darkness. The Middle Ages might feel distant, but the echoes of their play still resonate, especially when we're willing to listen. From pig jousting to nettle wrestling, medieval games prove one thing: human beings have always had a knack for turning the simplest ideas into unforgettable spectacles. Whether it was the absurdity of blindfolded wrestlers flailing in a pit of stinging plants or the sheer audacity of launching foxes into the air for sport, these pastimes reveal a universal truth: entertainment doesn't need to make sense to be memorable. What mattered was the thrill of the unexpected, the shared laughter, and the chance to push boundaries, even if those boundaries sometimes veered into the downright dangerous. Looking back, it's easy to cringe at some of these games. Goose pulling's cruelty or bear baiting's brutality feel worlds away from modern sensibilities. Yet buried beneath the chaos was something deeply human: the need to connect, compete, and escape the grind of daily life. A peasant sweating in the fields all week might find catharsis in the reckless abandon of Shrove-tide football, just as a nobleman weary of courtly politics could lose himself in the strategic drama of human chess. These games weren't just diversions, they were lifelines, offering a fleeting sense of control in a world where fate was often merciless. What's fascinating is how many of these traditions evolved or outright vanished as society changed. The same communities that once cheered for whipping tops or stone bowling eventually traded them for cricket and croquet. refining the rough edges into something more polished. Yet traces linger. Modern rugby scrums echo the mob mentality of medieval football, while carnival games like ring toss owe a debt to the precision of Skittles. Even the greased pole climb at county fairs feels like a distant cousin of plank walking, proving that the urge to test oneself against absurd challenges never really goes away. So which of these games would you dare to try? Maybe you're bold enough to imagine yourself balancing on a barrel for a round of pig jousting, or perhaps you'd rather spectate from a safe distance as others wrestle in nettles. Either way, these medieval antics remind us that play is timeless even when it's baffling, brutal, or just plain bizarre. Let us know in the comments which one caught your imagination. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's strangest corners. After all, who knows what other forgotten wonders are waiting to be rediscovered?